Hi everyone, welcome to the Tauranga Chamber of Commerce webinar on our post-budget analysis following yesterday's pretty eye-watering budget laid out by Minister Grant Robertson. Of course, we were delighted this time last week with his pre-budget announcement. There was a lot of good questions that came through from the audience, and as we wait for the attendees to trickle in, please feel free to, as Mark Lister as he talks, and as we carry on through, please use the chat, the Q&A session, and we will get to a pretty extensive Q&A session at the end of this. Just like to introduce our special guest speaker, Mark Lister, Head of Research at Craigs Investment Partners. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
No worries, Matt. Happy to be here.
Yeah, great. So level 2 yesterday, it was a good pretty good start for a lot of hospo and retailers, allowing people to go into the stores. A lot of traffic around Tauranga.
Yeah, certainly everyone I've spoken to anecdotally has given that sort of feedback, that there's definitely a bit of a buzz about, I guess, all of us being excited to have a few of those restrictions lifted, and that's great. You know, it's wonderful for small business, even though it's still a bit tricky for some, hospitality and so forth. It's still a really important step. So I think we can all be encouraged and enthusiastic about that, while at the same time just being a little bit mindful that you know, we still don't know how things might look in a week, a month, 3 months from now.
Yeah, look, before we get into your analysis and your presentation, what are your thoughts on where we're at right now in terms of going into level 2 and the $14 billion already invested?
Oh, look, I think we're in as good a place as we could be. The government and the Reserve Bank, for that matter, have moved as quickly and as swiftly and as strongly as anyone really could have expected over the last 2 months, and that's absolutely had an impact. It's provided an important lifeline and a safety net for many businesses and workers, and given a lot of confidence across the board. So that's all that's all wonderful. It's still a very murky sort of future from here, though. So I think while we should be positive about what we've seen in the budget, what we've seen already in terms of that spending, there's still a lot of question marks that we need to sort of think about how the answers might look, and there's still we're going to have to adapt, and we're still going to have to work fairly hard to come through this as best we can.
Great. Mark Lister, Head of Research at Craigs. Feel free to lead off with your presentation.
Okay, look, thanks, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll try and keep this relatively brief, because in these sorts of sessions, the bit that I enjoy most and that I think is the most valuable was that question time. So I would really encourage you to ask questions about anything under the sun, be it financial markets, which is my specialty, but also sort of the economics, what it means for business, the outlook for different sectors. Well, I'm going to talk about the budget, but I'm also conscious that we had the Reserve Bank announcement the day before that, and that is related to all this. More quantitative easing and money printing, talk about a negative OCR. So loads of topics out there, and feel free to throw any questions under the sun at me. I'll do my best to answer them, and I'll just tell you if it's something I don't have the answer to. But look, thinking about the budget, I would describe it, if I had to put it one word, and I would describe it as bold. It was a really bold budget. It was probably more generous and more stimulatory than I expected, at least. And what I mean by stimulatory is that I think there's more in it that will sort of drive activity or support activity. So that's good. There are certainly some fish hooks and some question marks, which we'll get to soon. But to just wrap up that overall package, it's basically a $50 billion package, which takes the total level of spending and support when you include that piece that's already been spent that Matt alluded to about $62 billion, which is a phenomenal number. It's sort of, you know, 20% of the New Zealand economy. So of that $50 billion package, they've spent about $20 billion already. The budget, or maybe a little more, the budget adds another $10 billion or so, and then we've got $20 billion set aside, ring fence, that will be allocated in the future, and you would expect that to come over the next few months. So just looking really briefly at some of those key areas of what was announced, the business support package was a key piece, 4 billion-ish, and a big bit of that was the wage subsidy scheme. So this is important. That was a bit more generous than many people expected. You know, having that extended another 8 weeks, it costs about 3.2 billion. It is much more targeted now. So before, to qualify, you had to show that your revenue had dropped 30%. Now you've got to show that your revenue's dropped 50%. So it is a much more sort of targeted policy. Now, a few interesting things to sort of take away from that. You know, 50% is a big number, and look, even if you are getting support to help with the wage bill, if you've faced a 50% fall in revenue, you're still in a very tough spot. So, you know, that's a safety net for the staff costs piece of your cost structure, but it doesn't do you any favors or give you any help with all of those other fixed costs you've got. Maybe it's rent, maybe it's sort of capital spending, maybe it's insurance, maybe it's rates, all of electricity, all of the rest of it. So I think it would be naive of us to think that that additional business support package will save every business. It won't. You know, under normal circumstances, there's a lot of businesses that just won't survive a 50% fall in revenue. So it's good, it's helpful, but it won't be the silver bullet that some people might hope it will be. It also is something that will be quite difficult to reverse the longer it goes on. You know, we can't do this forever. You know, we can't just extend and extend and extend forever. So we do have to sort of think about, you know, what happens in a 2 or 3 months time when that expires and people are sort of left on their own. We can cross our fingers that activities come back, the economy's recovered a little bit, people are spending more in shops and all the rest of it, but it is going to, the longer you sort of leave those structures in place, the more difficult it does get to unwind them. Other parts of the budget that I thought were interesting, trade and apprenticeships. Look, that's crucial. That's really important because we are going to see a big fall in unemployment. And I think if you look at the set of forecasts that we've seen, which are interesting in themselves, from both the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, which is where the budget ones come from, the economy is expected to fall hard in the June quarter. So we're probably right in the firing line now. Compared to where we were at the end of 2019, the economy is expected to contract about 24-25%, so fall by a quarter. Then it's expected to rebound quite strongly in the September quarter as sort of the restrictions are all lifted and normality starts to return, and then it gradually sort of rises. According to most of those forecasts, the economy doesn't get back to where it was at the beginning of this year until, you know, mid-2022. So we're still talking about, from here, it will take 2 years to get back to where we started. So it is going to be a long path and a long haul, and some would even say that might even be optimistic depending on how things play out. That means that unemployment will go up quite substantially. The forecasts show unemployment rising to 10% over the next sort of 6 months or so, and that's a big jump from where we were at the beginning of this year, about 4%. So it's a more than doubling in terms of unemployment. And then it obviously declines, and sort of we create some jobs, and hopefully sort of, you know, we grow a little bit and come out of this and do create some employment, but you still haven't got that unemployment rate returning to where it was before until 2022, 2023 even. So that trades and apprenticeship and education piece is quite crucial. People are going to need to retrain. Some industries just won't go back to their former glory in a hurry, if at all. So retraining is going to be important. The tourism sector got a fairly reasonable boost. You know, again, question marks over sort of how long that will last. You know, that sector will take a while to sort of get back on its feet, and I don't think it is quite enough to really completely sort of soften the blow. So you put all that together, you know, what looks like a $7 billion surplus a year ago now looks like a $28 billion deficit. So it's a massive hit, an absolutely massive hit. The government will have to issue government bonds to the tune of about 190 billion over the next 5 years. So this is how they'll pay for it. They're essentially going to issue bonds, which is, you know, IOUs. People buy them, investors buy them, and the Reserve Bank will do a lot of that buying. So that's why these two things are interrelated. So that's a massive bond issuance program, which is essentially borrowing to fund all this. That will see our net debt as a country sort of blow out big time. You know, we were at 20% before. Later this year, we'll end up at 30% of GDP, and it'll peak at about 53% in 2023. So that's a massive borrowing exercise. In nominal terms, rather than percentages, that's about 200 billion that we need to borrow. So it's huge, and we're really lucky that we've got the capacity to do that. We've had low government debt, lower than everywhere else in the world, and that's allowed us the ability to go on this spending spree to try and sort of soften the blow and sort of hold things up. So if you were to sort of look at what, if you were to poke holes in the budget and sort of, you know, look for sort of some things that could have been better, I guess the first thing you could point to is that it does look like one almighty band-aid. You know, there's money for Africa just going everywhere, left, right, and centre, and what we don't see is a strategy that's quite as cohesive as we might like to see in terms of how we come out. Just, you know, throw money at everything and then sort of cross your fingers and hope that sort of growth just emerges and sort of jobs just re-emerge. So I think it's probably a bit unfair to sort of, you know, point the finger at the authorities today for that. You know, they only finalised this budget on Monday, I think. Budgets are usually done 6 weeks in advance. They basically had to rip up the other one, start again. Yeah, they've done all they can. So now's not the time to have a go. I think you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt. However, I think over the next few months, and certainly sort of by the time we come up to the election, they've done that sort of big injection of money. What I'll be looking for 2 or 3 months down the track is to say, right, you know, we've put that sort of big safety net in place. We've put the band-aid on where needed. It's cost us a fortune. Now we're going to be saddled with this massive sort of level of government debt. What's the more specific plan? You know, what are we doing to come out of this? What changes do we need to make? So the pressure will be on the government to clearly articulate what they've got in mind in terms of a multi-year economic strategy, rather than just something to keep the wheels from falling off over the next sort of 2 months or so. And that big debt that we're saddled with, that sort of raises questions as well. You know, how do we pay that back? How does the next generation pay that back? Do we cut services? Do we raise taxes? Do we, ideally, you'd come up with an economic growth strategy and you'd grow your way out of that debt. You know, growth leads to bigger tax receipts, and bigger tax receipts, you know, allow you to sort of pay it back naturally. So that's the best course of action, or the ideal sort of scenario, but it's easier said than done. Or is that just the new normal? Is that just a permanent level of debt that we have to live with, which means a permanent level of very low, if not zero, interest rates, because we simply won't be able to afford to normalize those because, you know, the debt burden is too high. So lots of questions there. Probably talk long enough for the intro, Matt, so maybe I'll just stop there and we'll sort of see if there's any specific areas that people would like to take the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Mark. That was quite robust for an introduction. Please put your comments and questions into the chat, into the Q&A, and we'll try and work through them. Look, my first question, which I think you covered off, was I unkind when I spoke to the Bay plenty of times last night saying, pretty much, I'm going to be very old and grey by the time we pay back this debt, if we do. I was unclear on what the long-term vision is. It sounds like you've just outlined that it was a very quick turnaround for this budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was Zoe Hunter's article that you might have been quoted in, and I think I gave similar feedback to the reporters I spoke to. So we're probably on a similar page. It is hard to sort of find the specific strategy when you sort of look across the budget. It does just look like the shotgun approach of throw money everywhere and hope that sort of, you know, the growth comes, the jobs come, and that sort of everything, you know, resolves itself naturally. And the cynic would say it's an election year. That's, you know, what we should expect anyway. Look, I don't know what else you do. I don't envy the authorities, so I'm certainly not going to say I could have done a better job and I haven't got a different approach. But I think it is something that they need to turn their attention to. You know, they've put that safety net in place. They've provided all of the support. They've used our money and our children's money to do that, and we will have to pay that back at some point. So now they need to turn their attention. Whoever ends up in power post, you know, September 19th, whether it's the existing regime, whether it's someone totally different, whether it's sort of a slightly different looking existing regime, they need to very quickly turn their attention to, you know, what is the plan coming out of this? Which sectors do we sort of really support and grow and change? Which sectors are just, yeah, there's a whole range of questions, and we need to see specifics.
I think there's going to be an amazing public dialogue with all the political parties over the next 4 months heading into the election. That's probably the most exciting thing, which is, I think it will shape the election in terms of the recovery. So just one further question, which is around, there was a lot about spending, but very little around what cuts are going to be made, including contributions to the super fund. Were you surprised at that?
I didn't spot anything sort of on the super fund. So if there was something in there on that, enlighten me, because I missed that part, and happy to comment on it if you sort of remind me sort of what exactly came through. But there wasn't a whole lot in terms of cuts at all, really. You know, I don't think cuts would have gone down particularly well in terms of people's confidence and, you know, trying to provide a boost to sentiment. You know, when you're talking about sort of borrowing 200 billion over the next 5 years and blowing out government debt levels to more than double, you know, 2.5 times what we've seen, you know, cuts to services or spending are not really sort of part of the strategy at all. It's the complete opposite. You know, this is sort of a kitchen sink exercise. Throw everything you've sort of got up every sort of sleeve, turn over every rock and throw it at the problem. To shore things up. You know, I think sort of cuts or any sort of reductions are probably part of the discussion down the track. You know, if and when things do stabilize and get back on track, that's when there are really difficult decisions to be made around, well, you know, we use that rainy day fund and it's now gone. Is now the time to reduce some sort of spending, get a bit more frugal, raise taxes, talk again about the retirement age, try and figure out what the, you know, means test, pensions, I don't know. All of that stuff probably comes back onto the table. Land taxes, capital gains taxes, who knows? That probably comes back onto the table later. Whereas at the moment, when you've got unemployment sort of heading for double digits for the first time in 25 years, yeah, I don't know if sort of cutting services would go down particularly well. And even the opposition, you know, spokespeople have shied away from making any suggestions like that.
Yeah. Okay. There's been a question. We will head into the wage subsidy now. With Graham Wilson submitted a question saying, what was the exact definition of dates comparing sales period to qualify for the second tranche of subsidies? From what I heard, it was comparing with this time last year, right? Well,
yeah.
July.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it was it was on a monthly snapshot. So you'd take the month of whatever month it was, compare it to the same month a year ago. So I don't know, I guess it's June. You take June, you take July, compare it to last year's June or July, and you're either down 50% or you're not. I don't know how that, I think with the existing scheme, you just had to sort of tick the box to say, I'm expecting to be down 30%, and then sort of you worry about it later. And if you only ended up being down 10%, then you sort of, you know, maybe you pay it back, maybe you don't. So I'm guessing that sort of process will be similar or the same, to be honest. And that the only difference will be that the hurdle has changed from 30% to 50%.
So basically the government has said if your revenue hasn't reduced by 50%, essentially you should be taking up loans with banks or IRD and look for the loss carry back arrangements. And other than that, particularly for things like the tourism sector, we might be looking for them to perhaps take up the hibernation clauses for them to reappear once the borders are reopening. How's the sense in terms of that's SME world in terms of financing?
Yeah, look, the central bank, the Reserve Bank is really leaning hard on the trading banks to say, we have given you guys every sort of area of leniency we could in terms of reducing the burden on you, reducing regulatory costs that was sort of coming through. So they've basically given the banks a clear message to say, go out and help small business as best you can, and that's our expectation. And they also said earlier this week that any further reductions in interest rates and so forth, they expect the banks to pass those on in full. So there's been a clear message from the central bank to the trading banks. So I think help is there in terms of sort of some of those loan schemes and all the rest of it. Look, small businesses, it's going to be different for all of them. If you're a small business, you do want to make use of those options and pull those levers where you can to get through a period like this. But there's still going to be some tough decisions to be made. Some businesses that will suffer those big falls in revenues, they won't see a really particularly bright future ahead of them once the wage subsidies and expire and so forth. It's going to be some tough decisions to be made about whether those business owners want and whether it's wise for them to sort of take on another sort of significant debt burden. So yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it probably depends sort of what sector you're in, how quickly you see your business recovering, and many simply won't know the answer to that. But I would think a weakness of that whole sort of sphere could be that many business owners will be quite reluctant to take on additional debt at a time like this. A lot of small business owners have, the house was collateral for the business. Your house price is going down, by the way. So, you've got less collateral, in the first place. Do you want to be taking on more debt against this backdrop? If it's going to sort of help you sort of survive and then thrive on the other side, yes. But if it's just going to compound your problems and leave you with sort of a bigger burden that you will struggle to deal with, the answer could be different.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a sincere level of anxiety for a lot of businesses that won't qualify for the 50% wage subsidy or the second tranche. And they are talking to us through the Regional Business Partnership Program. And we have seen more inquiries looking for HR support and employment relations support. So they're having to make calls in late May for things to roll out, over the next month and to go through a process. So I think there's sincere levels of anxiety there. In terms of unemployment, the Treasurer's forecast of around 10%, is that conservative or is that a best case scenario? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, good question. I think it's probably a reasonable estimate. If we hadn't seen the additional spending that we saw yesterday, if they didn't sort of add anything more to the mix, if they just sort of, if things were just as they were, I think you'd be looking at higher than that. The Treasury did some scenarios, and their scenarios were, the worst one was north of 20%. Now that's probably just getting a little bit, silly. The best case scenario was sort of in the 8s though. Most of the banks and the Reserve Bank, who have all taken a sort of sensible, pragmatic view of things, have unemployment sort of in that 9 to 10% range. And I think that's fair. That's still massive though. In the GFC, unemployment didn't get to 10%. So you're talking about unemployment higher than in the GFC. Then again, you didn't have such a sort of wage subsidy and support package during the GFC either. But we need to go back to the, many sort of people on this session will remember the recession of the early to mid 90s. And that's where we have to go back to see unemployment sort of at those levels. We're not the only one in that boat. US unemployment, for example, started this year at 3.5% in America. That's the lowest that America had since 1969. So it was a 50-year low. Last month it hit 14.5%, and that'll go north of 20. Or it'll go close to 20. So this is something that's happening worldwide. You're probably on the right side of the ledger if it only blows out to 10. And then the big question is, how long does it take to recover? You know, there's a world of difference between unemployment spiking to 10, staying there for sort of 3 months, 6 months, and then sort of rapidly declining back to sort of 5 or 5.5, which is what is in all the forecasts. That's a very different outcome to unemployment spiking to 10 and sort of staying there for 12 months. So we just can't naively shy away from that. That is what is ahead.
Yeah, look, I think it's great that there's further support for R&D and exports in this budget, which is great. The conspiracy theorist inside of me is not connecting the dots between some increased military spending and the government's wanting to inject liquidity into New Zealand. So is there likely to be some international volatility?
International volatility, you're linking
Just in terms of markets, how Europe's going, though. I just saw on Radio NZ in terms of Europe having a second wave.
Yeah. Look, absolutely. There's volatility and risk globally, left, right, and centre. Political risk. There's a US election coming up this year. Trump is looking shaky. 6 months ago, I would have said he's a shoo-in to get back in. Now he looks 50-50. That scares me, because when he is when there's the prospect of him getting turfed out, that means he could do something even more outlandish than he sort of already has. You know, he could restart the trade war with China to sort of create a fabricated crisis that he can sort of try and pitch himself as the only person that can fix. So, you know, those trade wars between these big global powers haven't gone away. You've had the Chinese threaten to put tariffs and not take certain exports out of Australia, barley, beef, those sorts of things. Australia's our biggest trading partner. Australia's our second biggest outside of China, but you know, those linkages we can't ignore. Europe is still a bit of a basket case in many ways, and you have got sort of the second potential wave of the pandemic coming. No one knows how that's going to play out. You know, we had a health expert from the US. I had a meeting with them just before I started this call, and their view was, look, you can't wait for a vaccine where you sort of inoculate the whole population who would otherwise be healthy. That is 5 years to sort of do the testing to get a vaccine. So forget about sort of a vaccine coming in the next 6 or 12 months. It's not going to happen. The best you can hope for is a treatment to treat those people that sort of have got the symptoms, which really it mitigates the risk. It doesn't sort of eradicate the virus. So, you know, no one knows sort of how this will play out. We've got it under control. Some other countries have got it under control. Others haven't. But do we know if you get that second wave? The truth is we don't. So, you know, we've got all of those risks that we would have talked about pre-COVID, trade tensions with the rest of the world, political risk, and New Zealand's tiny little country at the bottom of the earth, dependent on exports and trade. We just go along for the ride. So there's still a huge amount of unknowns.
So with our borders remaining closed for a while, we will be relying on New Zealanders to build ourselves out of this hole. In terms of the skills and the retraining across the sector, do you think we're taking the right approach with the budget?
Yes, yep. I mean, there's in every likelihood there's going to be more to do. But the borders closed, that affects some sectors quite specifically. You know, looking ahead 6 months, there are many sectors that are still able to export and import. You know, agricultural products, food products, things are still moving. You know, the port will sort of have a lot of its operations and sort of exports back on track. So things are still moving, but the one thing that's not moving sort of is people, isn't it? So it's that, you know, it's that sort of international education space that might sort of feel the brunt of that. And tourism is without doubt sort of the one that's the key one in the firing line. So yeah, you're going to have a whole lot of, we'll get the Trans-Tasman bubble. I heard talk of, you know, there's talk of sort of others being added to sort of that over time. And look, that's helpful. That will soften the blow, but it won't take us back to where we were a year ago when you had just loads of German tourists, American tourists, Asian tourists. So you're still, no matter how you slice and dice it, you've got a fairly big chunk of tourism workers, maybe sort of some in the hospitality and other sectors as well, that have been displaced. They'll happily go back to tourism, you know, in 3 years' time or whenever, if the industry sort of gets back to where it was. But in the interim, we've got to think about other options for those people, and we can't just give them a shovel and say, "Oh, go and work on that building site." It's not that. It'd be nice for it to be that easy, but it's not. We've got to train these people to do something else. So, that's a partnership approach, I suppose. The government's part of that, the training organisation's part of that, the community's part of that, and I think we probably are doing all we can in terms of having the right approach and supporting it and wanting to do it, but you can't get away from the fact that takes a bit of time, doesn't it?
Yeah, see the ACT parties come out saying that this is a Barry Crump budget by saying with all the green jobs. I actually really like the concept of going and fixing a lot of these dock traps and doing a lot of pest control. What are your thoughts on the green jobs?
I think we'll take any jobs we can get over this next little while. So look, that's a great initiative. If that's going to sort of give people some work, it's work that we don't need to sort of spend them 2 years doing an apprenticeship to get prepared for. So we can sort of absorb a lot of those displaced workers, and why not take advantage of, the slow patch we're in tourism and all the rest of it to sort of fix some of those environmental issues we got. So look, I'm as capitalist as they come, but even someone sort of that has that financial market sort of capitalist view would be foolish to sort of not understand that one of the key strings to our bow as a nation is sort of our environment, our natural beauty, all the rest of it. So of course we should be supporting and doing as much work as we can on that front, because coming out of this, that will be our niche, that will be our selling point to the rest of the world, won't it? So again, you could sort of point to those policies and go, look, it's just a stopgap solution. It doesn't really lead to anything. Yeah, maybe, but we're probably not. We don't have the luxury of sort of being fussy at this point. If there's work to be done, and even if it does sort of just absorb some displaced workers for a period and leads to a better outcome somewhere else, then that's what you do.
Great. As we've reached 10 o'clock, we might have one final question and get your final thoughts. Is there anything that you thought should have been in there that wasn't, and any other final thoughts you may have?
From me, yeah. Look, I thought someone might have been cheeky enough to sort of ask about the negative OCR that has been talked about as well this week. That's something that I sort of get a lot of questions about, because it's sort of something that we sort of associate with these countries that are in deep trouble, like Japan with their economy that's been in trouble for 20 years, and sort of parts of Europe and so forth as well. Look, the Reserve Bank sort of mentioned the negative OCR. It's not off the table. Some banks think that we'll have one within 12 months. I guess the only point that I'd make there is, yes, it's a possibility. I think the Reserve Bank will continue to do more with their QE and their money printing, and a negative OCR is a possibility. That won't mean that any of us as depositors, with our money in the bank, will get a negative interest rate. You'll just get a very low one. And it doesn't mean that as borrowers with our mortgages or our small business lending, no one's going to pay us to have a mortgage, sadly. So I think the distinction I'd make is that negative OCR concept, if you're hearing about that in the media or in the press, that is sort of really between the Reserve Bank and the trading banks. For us as either borrowers or savers, we'll sort of stay in positive territory. But that's something we need to sort of keep an eye on as well, because that has implications for the Kiwi dollar. If we go into that sort of territory, the Kiwi dollar is lower going forward. Great for some exporters. Maybe that's a bit of a shot in the arm for some industries. But it also means that things maybe get a little bit more expensive, because our buying power is not quite as strong as it once was. So I think we need to keep an eye on some of those other financial market and sort of central bank policy changes, as well as what we're seeing from the government in terms of sort of the fiscal injections and so forth, because it is all tied in together.
Great. Oh, look, I think we might wrap it up there. That was a very good quality 30-minute session. Thank you very much, Mark Lister, Head of Research at Craig Investment Partners. Thank you to the Tauranga Chamber team that helped me pull this together. And if anyone has any further questions, you can feel free to connect with us later on. And of course, we'll share any further questions with Mark as well. Look, thank you very much, Mark, and I hope everyone enjoys some level 2 hospitality over the weekend. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.